Here's another look at the Rana Plaza disaster before we move into our look at global development. So as we've indicated already, there are differences in development around the world. And keep in mind that development includes both that increase in economic prosperity and quality of life. So when we look at a place like Dhaka, Bangladesh, we see that these garment industry employees are making 4 times the prevailing wage. But we ask ourselves, is quality life increasing at a noticeable or quantifiable rate as well? When we look around the world, we often split our countries into developed, also known as more developed countries, and developing, also known as less developing countries. What we have noticed over the recent decades is that the gap is widening between our developed countries and our less developed countries. Now, some countries have moved into the middle, countries like China, countries like Saudi Arabia. But what we're seeing is kind of like the stretching of a rubber band, where our developed countries are continuing to grow economic prosperity and improve quality of life, while our developing countries, while they are increasing prosperity and quality of life, they're not doing so at the same pace as our more developed countries. So as we go through, we're going to look at the different social and economic factors that contribute to development. And we're going to ask ourselves why and where. And we'll try to answer these 2 questions with some of our models of development. So our first look at measuring development is more of our traditional way of doing so, by using economic indicators. Economic indicators often rely on GNI, which looks at our per capita gross national product. And gross national product is good for measuring our total output. So what are we creating domestically? What are we sending abroad? It is a per capita number, so you don't get a really good picture about the entire population. The GNI per capita could be skewed a little bit. It only reflects what we're receiving in our formal economy. So it's what we could quantify, it's what we could track, it's what we could also tax. We don't look at the social or environmental costs when we look at GNI per capita. So countries like Saudi Arabia, located here in the middle, have a very GNI per capita. What is overlooked at this measure is the environmental toll of the gas and oil industry. What's overlooked here is the lack of rights for women. Half of our population isn't benefiting as much as the men are. So the GNI per capita gives us a good look at total output, and then we divide it by the number of people in the country. But it does overshadow a few things. It overshadows distribution. It overshadows different types of gender rights. It overshadows environmental toll. So historically, this was an indicator that was used to really show development. Now we still use it as part of a bigger puzzle. Another economic indicator is poverty, and poverty inherently carries with it a social costs. So when we look at poverty, yeah, we're going to look at that, we're going to measure it in terms of economic indicators, but we also need to recognize that health and education are part of this picture of poverty. And when we look around the world, it's very difficult to compare poverty. So poverty in the United States is nothing like poverty in Southeast Asia, where individuals in the United States, the poverty level is $25,000 for a family of 4. In developing countries, the poverty level is $1.90 a day in wages. So it's difficult to compare poverty around the world. But when we look at these individual countries, what we have seen is that extreme poverty has actually gone down. From 1990 to the present, extreme poverty has gone down about 2/3. As we've seen places, regions like Latin America and Southeast Asia really grow their economies and incorporate their countries into the global supply chain, we've seen the economies in these areas improve, and we've seen poverty lessen. Again, there's no conditions that we could state are universal across the world, but we have seen improvements, and again, poverty carries with it that economic and social factor. Our next look at measuring development looks at socioeconomic indicators. And socioeconomic indicators allows us to better understand not only the economic change, but also what's happening socially, what's happening culturally. This map shows us the Human Development Index, and you can see a stark pattern here where North America, Western Europe, Australia, and the southern cone of South America are doing very well with human development. And human development looks at income, so we're carrying forward that economic indicator, but it also looks at education. It also looks at life expectancy, right? So if we're looking at an increased quality of life, in addition to economic prosperity, education and life expectancy are two key indicators. Another measure is known as the Gender Inequality Index. And the Gender Inequality Index mirrors our Human Development Index. Places around the world where gender equality suffers are those places that are going to struggle to fully develop. An important idea is that people are the nation's most important resource, plays out in our Gender Inequality Index. If people as our most important resource are halved, or we're only allowing half of the nation's population to benefit, we're not going to ever experience our full potential. So these areas that are in red with highly unequal settings, these areas are going to struggle to fully develop, to realize their potential. The Gender Inequality Index measures things like election. Are our elections open? Are they free for men and women? Is there a high rate of teen pregnancy? Something we looked at with our demographic transition model. When economic and education opportunities open up, women will often postpone having children. So if they can't postpone having children, and we see a high rate of teen pregnancy, we'll then find limited opportunities, fewer opportunities for half of our population to catch up, to fully develop, to improve their quality of life. And our third indicator is environmental. The image on your screen is from Costa Rica. And Costa Rica is a good example of a country that has invested in sustainable tourism. When we look in other countries like Saudi Arabia, like Russia, we're looking at natural resource extraction, environmental degradation, short-term economic benefits. Places like Costa Rica are trying to be the model for sustainable development. The idea that we could adopt biodiversity as our source of tourism. We don't need to just cut down and clear forests for a natural resource. We could actually use what we have and attract people and do so in a sustainable, safe manner while we develop. So these three indicators, human development, gender inequality, and environment, are really more holistic ways of understanding how a country develops. Again, to reiterate, development includes economic prosperity and quality of life. Economic prosperity is certainly going to increase, or at least the chances of economic prosperity increase with better education and life expectancy through health. Gender inequality, right? Economic prosperity and quality of life are certainly going to improve if we are reaching our full potential by including our full population. As long as both halves of our population, men and women, have opportunities to work, pursue an education, vote in elections, we're going to see prosperity, economic and quality of life improve. So one of the key organizations, or one of the key coalitions that measures development and equality, is known as the OECD, which is an organization of economically cooperative economic cooperation and development that measures these different economic and social indicators around the world. And we could see here that one of the key goals of the OECD is to reduce inequality. And the graphic on your screen shows you the economic distribution around the world. And you can see places like North America, which only has about 5-6% of the global population has 37% of its wealth. So one of the things the OECD is trying to do is better incorporate different parts of the world, match skills, make sure that we're reducing barriers to increase economic prosperity. They're also looking to improve social conditions, and one of the key indicators they use for this socioeconomic look is the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient looks at the shared wealth by region. Again, it's a traditional model, but they've been able to adapt this into the 21st century. So the Gini coefficient in the OECD started tracking this in the 1960s. And today we still use the Gini coefficient as a way to measure equality and inequality. And the Gini coefficient, again, its primary focus is on income distribution. And you can see here that places like the United States are really middle of the pack, and that areas like Australia, areas like Canada, areas like some of the Eastern European states, they have more income equality. Now, income equality is not it's not a saving grace. There's a lot of shortcomings with this measure, but again, it's another way to look at equality and inequality around the world. Right. We're going to wrap up by looking at two development theories. The first theory is known as the Rostow model, and the Rostow model is also incorporated into the classical model of development. The Rostow model looks at 5 stages of economic development, 5 stages that look at how an economy changes over time. We looked at the demographic transition model before to understand how a population changes over time. The Rostow model looks at how an economy changes over time and carries with it some of the same assumptions. One being that time is our major difference here, that a society, a country, an economy will move through this model as long as they are patient, as long as they reduce corruption, and as long as they are open to change and international investment. We look at the shift from primary to secondary to tertiary and quaternary in this model. Now, in this model, the United States would be a high mass consumption country where goods that are produced for our consumers are primarily made overseas. Bangladesh is currently working up through the model. The country has transitioned from primary to secondary, and they're now in their takeoff stage. So if they embrace this period, if they reach their full potential, then they're going to be able to move into maturity. If we look at a country like China, back in the 1980s, China would have been in the takeoff stage, and they've moved into drive to maturity. If we look at the United States would have been in the takeoff stage over a century ago. They moved through drive to maturity into high mass consumption. The Rostow model looks at events like Rana Plaza, and it says that, yeah, this is a major disaster. This is a problem. It's also a growing pain. The United States experienced a similar growing pain over a century ago at the Triangle Waist Shirt Factory. So this model says that hiccups will happen, growing pains will happen, but a country like Bangladesh is on the right path. Our second model, which arose from the dependency theory in the 1970s, looks at core periphery. The idea that the core is going to benefit at the expense of the periphery. So despite the gains in the periphery in places like Bangladesh with slightly better wages, the majority of the benefit will always go to the core. So the core is going to benefit more through lower prices, through greater mass consumption, through a better quality of life, where the periphery is going to get stuck. It's going to get stuck supporting the core. And if you're stuck supporting the core, you're not going to diversify. You're going to you're going to have long-term uneven development. This idea of cumulative causation suggests that growth begets growth, that the core, the dominant force here, is going to continue to grow at the expense of the periphery. Some gains may be made, there might be some shift to the middle, but the core will always dominate this relationship at the long-term expense of the periphery.